Well, this is going to be the last weekend's action before we get into Decision Day around MLS. And for this last weekend's action before Decision Day around MLS, we are going to have 13 games, with 2 of them is going to be taking place tomorrow on Halloween, and 11 that is going to be taking place on Sunday. And what I'm going to also do from now on with these preview is that I'm going to talk about playoff scenario and also how there is definitely some battle in terms of seeding, home field advantage, and avoid to play in the play-in round if you are in the Eastern Conference. And that I decided to do that because rather do another separate video like what I did last time, talk about the playoff scenario, I might as well just kind of include it into the preview, and I don't have to really do a separate video about that. But anyway, let us get into the first game, which is the matinee game that's going to be happening on Halloween, which is the Texas Derby between FC Dallas versus the Houston Dynamo. We have a couple of Derby games that is going to be happening this week, and this is one of those games where we could potentially see one team that is pretty much on the verge of clinching their playoff position, and one team that could also be eliminated after this game. As for Dallas, they currently have a record of 7-7-5, and that they will clinch playoffs if they, of course, are able to win or tie against Houston. So, as long as they don't actually lose to the Dynamo, they basically punch their ticket as the next team that is going to make it in the Western Conference. Now, in case if they do lose to Houston, they can hope to rely on Vancouver to lose or tie against Portland, or RSL to lose or tie versus the Galaxy for them to also punch their ticket in terms of making the playoffs. Now, for the Houston Dynamo, who has a 4-9-8 record, well, they are definitely on the brink of elimination. And the simplest way for the Dynamo to be eliminated from the playoffs is that if they do not win against Dallas, yeah, they're pretty much eliminated from the playoffs, and that this is an absolute must-win situation right now for the Dynamo to keep their really tiny hope of playoffs alive. But besides that, there's also 4 other scenarios that they could get themselves eliminated. If they do tie against Dallas in this game, well, then if Colorado is able to tie versus the Seattle Sounders, they will also get themselves eliminated. And that if they do tie versus FC Dallas again, if Vancouver ties with Portland, they'll also get eliminated. Same scenario, if they tie with FC Dallas and RSL was able to win against the Galaxy, yeah, they will also be eliminated. And the final scenario is that if Colorado is able to win against Seattle, or Portland was able to, or Vancouver was able to win against the Portland Timbers, yeah, that will also mean that the Houston Dynamo is on the verge of elimination. And by the way, the prediction box is back in this video. So I know in the past couple of weeks, and especially in the last video, somebody commented, tell me, what happened to the prediction box? Why hasn't I put it in the preview? Well, the reason why I haven't bring the prediction box in the last couple of videos is because I just run out of room in terms of putting the box into each of their boxes. But this week, I was fortunate the fact that I have plenty of rooms in terms of putting my prediction box. And for my prediction of this game, I'm actually going to change my pen and change it to a red one, because this pink one doesn't really display very well. But I'm going to say Dallas is going to win this one. Obviously, Dallas is the team that do not lose at home, and that this is a team that, despite the fact that they kind of got off to a bit of a rough patch, they did get that big 2-1 win against Inter Miami, which really boosted their chances of making the playoffs, and I think they're going to wrap it up in terms of clinching themselves in the playoffs against a Houston team that is really struggling right now. And because of the fact that they have only won 1 game out of their last 12 games, this is basically the position that they're in right now. And as I said before, for this Dynamo team, if they want to think about making a late playoff push, they got to get things going, because this bad run that they've been going in with them drawing a lot of games and losing games on the road, those are the resort that is not going to get yourself into the playoffs, and that right now they're really on the brink of potentially not making the playoffs if they aren't able to win against Dallas, or if they do tie against Dallas, depending on what the other resort is going to go, they could also be one of the first one to be eliminated from the playoffs in the Western Conference. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is Nashville and the Chicago Fire. So this is the nightcap of the Halloween matchup, as this game is going to kick off at 8:30 p.m. Eastern, 5:30 p.m. Pacific. Nashville is currently 7-7-6, and they have, of course, clinched the playoffs and become the 6th team to clinch the playoffs in their expansion year. Although, if you're Nashville, despite the fact that you clinch the playoffs, and certainly Nashville fans are happy about that, I'm pretty sure they're still very hungry in terms of seeding, because, as I mentioned before in the Eastern Conference, there seems to be a battle not only for the Supporters' Shield and also for home field advantage and all those teams that's battling for the last couple of spots in the playoffs. But there's also a battle known as the battle to avoid playing in the play-in round, and it seemed like right now, with all those teams between 6th through 8th place right now, all of them are kind of bundle up each other. And actually, technically, if you look at the standings, Nashville actually is 1 point behind the team below them, that is New England and the Red Bulls. But the only reason why they're above them is because they have a game in hand over them. And that, did I also mention the fact that points per game basically will determine the final standing this year? Well, if you don't know that right now, you maybe should have watched my video talk about how the league has officially announced that points per game will determine the playoffs. And, the Eastern Conference is not going to be a bit of a problem, because at the end of the day, I think every single team is going to play the same amount of game at the end of the day. And that for Nashville, their makeup game is going to be against Dallas, I believe, during the midweek action. So, yeah, they're definitely in a driver's seat in terms of avoiding to play in the play-in matchup, but they have to face against a Chicago team that is still fighting alongside with 3 other teams for that last spot of the playoffs, and that they're actually tied with those 3 other teams with the likes of Miami and DC United that is right behind them and are currently tied with them in 10th position. But the good news for the Fire is that they actually have a game in hand, just like Nashville, that they have to make up for in that midweek game against Minnesota, and that in some way they still control their own destiny in terms of potentially making the playoffs and be the last team that makes it in the Eastern Conference. But either way, this is going to be a very big game for both of these teams, and I'm going to say Nashville will win this, mainly because I really think Nashville, for the past couple of games, they have just been red hot lately, and they have found different ways to beat you. I mean, a lot of people have talked about the way that Nashville always beats you is that they just suffocate you, and they able to just make it really hard for you to break down on the defensive end. But this is also a team that has also been scoring goals lately, and especially at home, they definitely have been getting things going on the attacking end. So don't be surprised if Nashville is able to get all 3 points against a Chicago team that, they're also going to be desperate to try to get points in this game, because they have to try to make sure as they head into that game against Minnesota that they still control their own destiny in terms of making the playoffs and hanging on to that last playoff spot. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is going to be the start of the Sunday game, which we start with a matinee game between Columbus versus the Philadelphia Union at 3:30 p.m. Eastern, 12:30 p.m. Pacific. Now, unlike this one that unfortunately is going to be on Twitter, this one is going to be on ABC, as this game is a battle between the team that's currently leading the Supporters' Shield standings, that is the Philadelphia Union, with a 13-5-3 record, and that they have a 3-point lead over Toronto in the Supporters' Shield standings. But there is a little bit of a bad news for the Union, that if you remember from the last game, that Andre Blake basically got substituted of what looked like was a hand injury. Well, it's basically confirmed that he is not going to be played in this game, although Jim Curtin did say that there is no official confirmation that he's going to be out for the season. So at least the good news is it's probably not as a serious kind of injury that pretty much will mean he's going to be done for the season. But the bad news is you don't know when exactly he's going to come back, and I know for sure that Andre Blake is probably one, if not the most important player on that Union team. Like, there's been so many times this season he's been stealing points for the Union with some incredible save. And while Joe Bendik is still a decent goalkeeper, he's definitely not going to be as good, and the fact that there's going to be he's going to have a lot of shoes to fill in terms of trying to fill in the spot that Andre Blake currently occupied. Now, for the Columbus Crew, they are currently in third place in the Eastern Conference, but are tied with Orlando on points and have a record of 10-5-5. But this is definitely a Columbus team that has really struggled and have only won one game out of their last 7 matches. And that, I guess the only good news for the Crew is that, yes, they are starting getting guys back coming in to this game, and I'm assuming most likely they're going to most likely get some of their starters back. Maybe Zaire could be back in this game alongside with the likes of Nagby and Room going to be playing in this one. But either way, this is definitely a big game for both of these teams. You know, for Philly, they I believe if they could win this game against Toronto, I think they pretty much will wraps up in terms of the Supporters' Shield race. Actually, I think if they do win this game, and if Toronto does drop points in their weekend matchup, then they pretty much have clinched their spot in terms of the Supporters' Shield standings, because there's just going to be one more game after this for both of these teams. But for this game, I'm going to say, I want to say Union has a good chance to win, but again, that Andre Blake injury is making me kind of a little bit nervous, and knowing the fact that Columbus desperately needs to kind of get things going after this bad run that they were in, I'm going to say Columbus. I'm going to go with the home team, who, you know, the Crew this season, if there's one thing, despite the fact that they've been struggling a lot this season, if one, or at least in the latter part of the season, if there's one thing that they've been remained very good at, is their home form. I mean, they have been just absolutely amazing, and that Montreal Stadium has just been an absolute fortress this season. So I'm going to go with Columbus winning the Union in this one and get a chance for them to kind of stay away of the uncertainty that they could definitely have a chance to potentially foul out of the home field advantage, since there is a certain team that is kind of right behind them besides Orlando City that is just 2 points behind them. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is going to be the elimination derby between Atlanta versus FC Cincinnati. And the reason why this is the elimination derby is that I'm pretty sure one of these teams, if not both of these teams, could be on verge to be eliminated coming out of this match. For FC Cincinnati, they are definitely look like in destiny in terms of potentially getting eliminated in this week, as all they need is if they do not win or able to, actually, I'm not sure why I said win here. It's actually lose or tie right here. But yeah, if they do not win against Atlanta, and if they do lose or tie against Atlanta, well, that means they are officially eliminated from the playoffs. Whereas there's other ways that they could also get eliminated in the playoffs, even if they win. If Miami is able to win against TFC, or DC United is able to win against New England, or Chicago is able to win against Nashville, yeah, that is also another way that they could get themselves eliminated from the playoffs. Now, for Atlanta, they of course will be eliminated from this playoffs if they lose or tie against FC Cincinnati and Miami is able to win Toronto. Another way they could get eliminated is that if they lose or tie against Cincinnati and DC is able to win against New England, they'll also get themselves eliminated. Whereas another way that they can also get eliminated is that if they lose or tie against Cincinnati and that Chicago is able to win against Nashville, then they basically will get themselves eliminated. But either way, you know, this is definitely the elimination derby, and in some way you could say the sad derby, because even if one of these teams does stay alive coming out of this game, most likely they could be on the brink of elimination, and that heading into the final week of decision day, they could definitely find themselves on the brinks of elimination again, and that basically that their hopes in terms of making the playoffs is definitely shrinking by the minute. But either way, you know, I want to say Atlanta has a chance to win this game because of the fact that how much struggling FC Cincinnati is, and it seemed like they pretty much just kind of pack it up. But I'm going to be a little bit Crew and say it's going to be a draw in this game, and that, you know, I feel like since both of these teams have kind of been having such a miserable season, and that their fan base are calling for their team to get eliminated as soon as possible to kind of put them out of the misery, I guess a draw will pretty much be just the icing on the cake, because I think if this game does end in a draw, Cincinnati obviously will be eliminated, and that Atlanta, depending on the other result that could go against them, they will also get themselves eliminated in this game. So in some way, a draw will just kind of put out the misery of both of these teams of just having such a horrible season, and they're really looking toward next season and have some big things to do in the off season to kind of correct what has just been a nightmare season for both of these teams. But moving on, in terms of the next match, and I'm actually just going to move the board a little bit because there is some sunlight that is kind of blocking the board a little bit. But the very next game is going to be none other than the Hudson River Derby between NYCFC versus the Red Bulls, where this game is going to kick off at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. I'm very surprised this is not going to be on national television, because usually when you have the Hudson River Derby, it's usually going to be on national television, but instead, this is actually just going to be on the regional network. As coming into this game, NYCFC have a 10-3-8 record, and the Red Bulls have an 8-5-8 record. Both of these New York teams basically clinched their playoffs in the midweek action, with NYCFC currently in 5th in the Eastern Conference and are 2 points behind Orlando and Columbus for 3rd place. So, as I mentioned earlier, that certain team that is potentially could still have a chance to catch Columbus and Orlando for that home field advantage, that would be NYCFC, who still does have a feint of hope. Although the problem is that they actually have played one more game than what Columbus and Orlando City has, and that they really need to hope that they can, of course, win this game. And depending on if Philly can help them out or Montreal can help them out in terms of getting a result, they could really get themselves back in the picture of getting home field advantage. Now, for the Red Bulls, we know that they're probably not going to get a home game this year unless they are playing in the play-in round. Although, if you ask any Red Bulls fan, if they want to have home field advantage in this, they probably don't want it to happen in the play-in round, as they are one of those teams that I mentioned earlier, alongside with Nashville and New England, that is really battling for that last spot to avoid playing in the play-in round in the Eastern Conference. And they're currently in 7th place in the Eastern Conference, and that, they're actually also tied with New England on points right now and have one more points than what Nashville is. But obviously Nashville is a team that have one more game ahead of the Red Bulls and New England, and if they are able to take that game in hand and take advantage of getting all 3 points, then that means that they will basically once again find themselves behind Nashville coming into decision day. But either way, this should be a very interesting kind of matchup, and that I'm going to say this is a draw in this game, because this is kind of hard to predict with both of these teams having been doing pretty well in the last couple of games. I mean, the Red Bulls have really been kind of a cardiac energy drink kind of team for the past couple of games, because of the way that they had 3 straight games where they were able to score goals literally in the dying minute of game, including in the last game they were able to score an 89th minute winner to win that one. Whereas for NYCFC, they've been consistent enough to get themselves still stuck in this 5th place position, and that they also have some decent win that they were able to kind of bounce back after some tough losses that they suffer in some of those games. So this is kind of a bit of a tough one to say, and if I have to predict who's going to win this one, I'll say the Red Bulls, because they do have a better record against NYCFC in terms of this Hudson River Derby. But either way, I'm going to say it's just going to be a draw between both of these teams. But moving on into the last game on this board is going to be Montreal versus Orlando City, which is going to kick off at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. The Impact is 7-2-12, while Orlando is 9-8-5. Montreal, they will clinch a playoff position if they do get a win against Orlando, and if DC United is able to lose or tie against New England, and that Miami is able to lose or tie against Toronto. So they do have to have a lot of things that kind of go in favor of them if they want to clinch a playoffs. But you never know. They can get a victory in this game against Orlando City, they can definitely be in a good position themselves heading into decision day to potentially clinch for the playoffs. Whereas for Orlando, they're currently tied with Columbus in that third spot of the Eastern Conference. And even though, as I said, they are 2 points ahead of NYCFC, and I did say that NYCFC is definitely started to try to catch them up and potentially take that last spot of the home field advantage, at least for the first round in the Eastern Conference away. At least they do have a game in hand over NYCFC in that one. And that this is also kind of a big game, I would say. I think this is definitely a bigger game for Montreal than is for Orlando City. Obviously for Montreal, with how much they have been struggling, and that there's been times where they also have kind of looked inconsistent. This is definitely a game that they really want to win, because heading into the last game of the season and pretty much on decision day, guess who they're going to be playing on decision day? Yep, that's right, it's DC United, that team that is red hot right now and potentially could get into the playoffs. And I have a feeling if they do not win against this game against Orlando City, or if they don't get any points in this game against Orlando City, there's going to be a lot of pressure for Montreal heading into that final game of the season against DC United, and that is definitely going to be a game that I think could really determine playoffs. Depends on what happened in the Montreal game and also in the DC United game. But either way, I am going to say, I'm just going to predict that Montreal is going to win this, because they have more to play in this game compared to Orlando, that maybe they're going to think about resting some of their guy. And that, one thing about Orlando is that, yes, they did get a big victory against Atlanta, which is great, but here's the thing, when you get a big emotional victory like that, and then the very next week you have to play the likes of Montreal, it can easily be a time where you could definitely have a letdown playing against a much inferior opponent. So yeah, this is definitely a game that is definitely going to be a little bit of a challenge, even if they're playing it against a Montreal team that is struggling. But that being said, this is an Impact team that is desperate to get all 3 points if they want to head to potentially the final week of the season in a very good shape of making the playoffs, or the fact that they are, if depends on what resort that is going to go in favor of them, they could well and wrap up their playoff position and don't have to head to decision day with still kind of scenarios that they could still be either eliminated or potentially getting into the playoffs in that final game against DC United. But that being said, I am now going to switch the boards and look at the last 6 games, or actually look at the next 6 games that is going to happen, because there's actually 7 more games that I have to talk about. But yeah, I'm gonna now switch the board and look at the next 6 games that is going to happen. But yeah, moving on, in terms of the next match, is New England and DC. So the Revs are going to be playing against a red-hot DC side that is currently have a record of 5, 6, and 10, while the Revs have a record of 7, 8, and 6, as this game kicks off at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. Now, New England, of course, they did clinch the playoffs in the last game, despite the fact that they did lose to the Red Bulls at the very last minute. But they're currently tied with the Red Bulls in the 7th spot in the Eastern Conference. And as I said before, them alongside with the Red Bulls in Nashville is battling for that 6th spot and a spot to avoid playing in the play-in round in the Eastern Conference. Whereas for DC United, as I said, they have been red hot lately and are just making a late playoff push thanks to this 3-game winning streak that they're in, and also they've been unbeaten in 4 games. But despite the fact that they have been red hot lately, they are still going to be up for elimination this week, although it is kind of very unlikely, unless if they do lose to New England and Montreal is able to win or tie against Orlando City, and Miami is able to win against Toronto FC. But obviously, I think DC is going to stay alive for another week. And, as I said, the thing that I've been very impressed about DC isn't just because of how you can clearly see this team has has completely looked different, and they're just re-energized ever since Ben Olsen is no longer on this team. But the way that they've been playing lately, it might not have been the prettiest soccer to watch, and in some way they're kind of doing something that Nashville is doing this season, where they're able to just score enough goals and able to keep tight on the defensive end to get these 1-0 result. But at the end of the day, these 1-0 result also mean 3 points, and right now, with how hot that DC is, and the fact that New England, since this is a home game for them, and how much they struggle at home, and especially how much for the last couple of games they still struggle trying to go on into the final third and unable to break team down or look very lackluster when it ever gets to it. I have no doubt that DC is going to win this game, and that in some way they will also feel like this is going to be a must-win game, knowing the fact that they're this close. Like all this effort that they put in, they definitely don't want it to be all wasted just because they lost this game against New England and they're on verge of getting eliminated. And in a neutral perspective, I also hope DC doesn't lose this game either, because I really want to see what happened in that DC versus Montreal game, where most likely that game is going to be national televised, and that game is going to be a one that could potentially determine the last couple of spots in terms of the playoff position in the Eastern Conference. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is none other than Sporting KC versus Minnesota. So I'm just gonna make my prediction right now, because obviously whenever the Loons play against SKC on the road, it's an automatic loss for the Loons. I mean, I don't even need to kind of get into talk about how their record is 8-6-5 and Sporting KC is 11-3-6, and that Sporting KC, despite the fact that they has the most points in the Western Conference, they're second because Seattle has a better points per game ratio, and that for the Loons, they did clinch their playoff spot after the announcement of points per game system, which is probably one of the weirdest way to finally announce that, hey look, we clinched our playoff spot, because of the fact that the league decided to go on a points per game, and it seemed like we just have enough in terms of our points per game total, and therefore now we're in 4th place and owns the last spot. But in terms of at least getting one game at home in the first round of the playoffs in the West, and have a slight advantage of points per game ratio over LAFC. But the reason why I immediately said Sporting KC is going to win this is because, again, whenever the Loons play against Sporting KC at Children's Mercy Park, it is an automatic win for Sporting KC, because they never lose to Minnesota when they're playing at home, and that Children's Mercy Park is basically a house of horror for the Loons. And, as much as I'm happy the fact that the Loons are back in the playoffs, this also does mean that, most likely Adrian Heath is going to act this as a throwaway game, and that he probably most likely is going to go with a very weak squad and trying to play for a 0-0 draw against Sporting KC, like he has done pretty much every single time whenever Minnesota play against SKC on the road, and he's just going to take his chances against Chicago, which, that mindset, I don't mind that is the case in terms of them having a better chance in terms of getting more points, so that they can maybe secure their spot in terms of hope at least one game at home at Allianz Field in this playoffs. However, my issue with that is that this is probably the only team out of the last two teams, well, maybe besides Dallas on decision day, but this is really the team that can be a huge litmus test for Minnesota in terms of where they're actually at and what are their chances of making a deep run, whether they can make a deep run, or if this is just going to be just a pretender kind of team in the Western Conference. Because I really think with the way that the Loons have looked in the last couple of games, they just have not looked good at all, and doesn't look like a team that is going to make a deep run into the playoffs. And if we can get a win in this game, that does give me a little bit more confidence about it. But like I said, most likely that ain't going to happen, because again, Adrian Heath is going to go with a weak team. He's going to act like this is a throwaway game. And congratulations to Sporting KC, you just got yourself all 3 points in this game and have a chance in terms of try to catch Seattle for that top spot in the Western Conference. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is Toronto versus Inter Miami. So this is going to be a matchup between one team that is not going to be eliminated from this week, but they also are not on verge of clinching the playoffs. And then a team that is desperate in terms of trying to get a win if they want to keep their small Supporter Shield hope alive. With TFC currently have a 12-5-4 record, and that they need to win or tie to keep a small Supporter Shield hope alive in this game. Against a Miami side that is currently in 11th place in the Eastern Conference and actually tied with two other teams for the last spot of the playoffs, as this game kicks off at 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. And you know what? I'm going to say Miami's going to win this one because, there's definitely a lot of concern with TFC right now with the way that their attack has just looked absolutely dreadful in the past couple of games. And yes, I understand that there is injuries that on that attacking front that has really kind of crippled in terms of their attacking end. But, you still need to, of course, play the game even if you have to deal with these injury issue, and it just feels like the last couple of games, and in some way they're kind of going the same situation to what Columbus had to deal with a couple of weeks ago, where once all those star players that got injured on their team, that's when the resort is starting to kind of turn sideways. And if you're TFC, if you're Greg Vanney, I think, Supporter Shield, I don't think it's something that they're thinking about anymore, because even though I wrote that it was a small hope to keep their Supporter Shield alive, if that they need to get a win or a tie, most likely that's not going to happen, because I think the Union probably got that spot. But, now heading into the playoffs, and you still don't know whether or not if you're going to get those star players like with the likes of Akinola, Altidore, or even Piatti back in the start 11, that is definitely going to be very, very concerning, knowing the fact that without those guys, this team looks absolutely dreadful and doesn't look like a team that is ready to make a deep playoff run. Whereas you're facing against a Miami side that is desperate. Like, they are desperate to try to get things going. And, they've been very inconsistent for the past couple of games. We've seen them seems to, go in a game where they're able to win, and then the very next game they were able to draw points or lose that game. So, in theory, because of that inconsistent form, this means that Miami may be due to get a big win against TFC. I mean, either way, I think that they definitely are looking to try to get a win in this game, because despite the fact that the very last game that they get to play, which is at home against FC Cincinnati on decision day, and you would think that should be a win for them, they will also hope that they can head into that last game of the season in a good position, or even in the driver's seat in terms of making the playoffs this season. So yeah, I'm gonna say Miami is gonna win this, because I think they're the more desperate side against the TFC team that has really struggled in the past couple of games. But moving on, in terms of the next match, is none other than Colorado versus the Seattle Sounders. So the Rapids, obviously, they are probably now the most hated team in the Western Conference, and probably the most hated team right now in MLS, because of the fact that we are going to go with a points per game system. Colorado is actually now automatically in. Well, I wouldn't say automatically, but they got themselves now into the playoffs and currently are in the 8th spot. But as I said, despite the fact that they are in that 8th spot, they need to start to get things going if they want to improve their points per game ratio, because it's one thing to come back to play in MLS with a good points per game, but it's another if you don't get resort, that point per game ratio is going to continue to go down, and there are actually teams that is right behind them in terms of trying to get themselves back above the red line. Whereas they're playing against a Sounders team that currently has a 10-5-4 record, and they currently are at the top of the Western Conference, despite the fact that they do have one less point than Sporting KC, because the fact that they have a game in hand and their points per game ratio is better than Sporting KC. That's why they are at the top of the Western Conference. Whereas for Colorado, well, they can actually clinch the playoffs and really pissed off a lot of those teams that is below them and around them, if they can, of course, get a win against Seattle, and that Vancouver is able to lose or tie against Portland, and RSL have to of course, tie against the Galaxy or in this game between RSL and the Galaxy, that game has to be with a tie. So there's still a lot that needs to determine if the Rapids are going to make the playoffs. But I'm going to say Seattle is going to win this because the Sounders, they clearly have some of their guys that is either on international duty or currently on the injury reserve back, and they are definitely hungry to trying to get more points and really secure that top spot in the Western Conference. And it looked like the road to MLS Cup out of the Western Conference have to go through CenturyLink Field. Whereas for the Colorado Rapids, they're definitely desperate in terms of trying to get some points. I mean, I know for the last couple of games it's been tough for them because first they had to jump back into MLS action after they got through a month without resting, and then they have a very short week and have to travel on a 3-day rest against a Minnesota team that they almost pulled off a draw out of this game, and that they're looking to trying to get points and back at their home stadium. But it's not going to be easy to play against a Sounders team that, again, this is a Sounders team that is hungry and looking to try to get a couple of games in or a couple of wins in a row to get themselves in a good run heading into the playoffs and looking to try to defend their crown in the MLS Cup. But moving on into the next game on this board is going to be Portland versus Vancouver. So I call this the Providence Park Derby because technically both of these teams, at least for this year, is going to be playing at Providence Park, as this is going to be a 10 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Pacific kickoff. The Timbers have a 10-5-5 record, while the Whitecaps, surprisingly, still have not yet to draw this season with an 8-0-13 record. Portland, of course, are in third in the Western Conference according to the points per game standings. Again, they do have one more point than what SKC had right now, but because of the fact that they play around the same amount of game that SKC has been well, actually, Portland has one less point than what SKC has right now, and therefore that's why they are currently in third in the Western Conference. Whereas for the Vancouver Whitecaps, well, they're kind of up for elimination in this game, but just like Colorado, where their clinching scenario had to not only rely on them to win, but also depending on how other resort is going to go, they also are in a situation where they most likely is not going to be eliminated unless if everything kind of goes wrong against them. Because if for this game, they can win, they're not going to be eliminated from the playoffs. But if they do lose this game against the Portland Timbers, and if the Quakes are able to win or draw against LAFC, and Colorado is able to win against Seattle, then yeah, they are going to be eliminated from the playoffs. The other way is that if they do tie against the Timbers and the Quakes are able to win against LAFC and the Colorado Rapids is able to win against the Seattle Sounders, that is another way for them to get eliminated. But either way, with all those crazy scenario, I most likely think they're not going to be eliminated this week, and that it's going to really come down to the wire heading into the final week of the season. And knowing the fact that Marc Dos Santos, I thought the last game when they played against the Sounders was kind of a throwaway game for them, knowing the fact that they start a lot of young Canadian and kind of put a reserve team in that. He's pretty much putting all his eggs in the basket against the Timbers, which, yeah, that probably might not be a good opponent to put all your eggs in the basket against the Timber side that just put 5 past the Galaxy the previous week. But that being said, one thing I will say with the Whitecaps is that at least, since even though they're the road team in this game, they're technically not the road team because they've been playing at Providence Park pretty much throughout their entire season. So they're going to be trying to hope that they can maybe use their temporary home advantage against the Timbers. But I really think coming into this game, Portland is definitely going to be favorites in this because you can clearly see that they're looking alongside with Seattle, looking to try to get themselves in a good run heading into the playoffs so that they can potentially go into the playoffs with some confidence. And that I know this might be early to say that, and I don't kind of want to jinx anything, but if Portland and Seattle is going to continue to go on a good run for the rest of the season, something tells me they're going to meet again in the playoffs, isn't it? I mean, something just tells me that this is look like it's going to be destined, that both of these teams are going to be meeting in the playoffs. And heck, when they meet again in the playoffs, yeah, that is going to be a really, really fun match, and I can't wait to see how that is going to be. Like, I remember back in 2018, I believe, when they met in the playoffs and how fun that matchup was in the playoffs, and it actually turns out to be one of the greatest playoff series I've ever seen in the MLS playoffs. I hope we're going to have something similar to that if both of these teams are going to meet, because they're definitely could potentially on a collision course of meeting each other either in the conference final or potentially in the conference semifinal of the Western Conference. But moving on into the last game on this board is going to be the Galaxy against RSL. So you know how earlier I said the Atlanta versus FC Cincinnati game was the elimination derby? Well, that was the Eastern Conference version of elimination derby. This is the Western Conference version of the elimination derby, because there is definitely a chance that both of these teams could be eliminated, or at least one of these teams could be eliminated from the playoffs. And that team that could most likely be eliminated in the playoffs is none other than the Galaxy, who currently have a 5-3-11 record, and RSL has a 5-7-8 record. This game kicks off at 10:30 p.m. Eastern, 7:30 p.m. Pacific. The Galaxy, they of course will be eliminated if they lose against RSL, so anything that is not a draw or a win will mean that the Galaxy is going to be eliminated from the playoffs. Now, if they do draw against RSL, they will also hope that Colorado doesn't win against Seattle, because if that's the case, they'll also be eliminated from the playoffs. And the other way that they're going to get eliminated is that if they tie against RSL and Vancouver is able to win against the Portland Timbers, yeah, that is also another way for them to get eliminated. Now, for RSL, they of course are going to be eliminated if they do lose to the Galaxy and that Colorado is able to win against the Sounders. Or if they do lose to the Galaxy, Vancouver, if they win against Portland, then yeah, they also would get eliminated. And the final way that they get eliminated is that if they do draw against the Galaxy, then if Colorado and the Quakes are able to get a win, well, the Quakes are able to get a win or a tie against LAFC, and Colorado is able to get a win against Seattle, that's another way for them to get eliminated in the playoffs. And just like what I said about the elimination derby in the Eastern Conference, the Western Conference version of the elimination derby is also going to end in a draw, just so that I think this might just kind of maybe put out the misery of the fact that both team is going to pretty much eliminated. And again, I think out of both of these teams, and especially after the Galaxy just got absolutely destroyed by the Timbers, that led to the firing of their head coach Scaleto, and RSL, you know, in that elimination 6-pointer, I said that was the game. Whoever loses that game is probably going to be the one that's not going to make it to the playoffs. Well, RSL lost that game, and now they're really staring down the barrel in terms of the team that probably is not going to make the playoffs unless if there's going to be some miracle that is going to happen. And that I think both of these teams have suffered some very rough season, and that I think a draw is only fair to just kind of hope that would just end the misery in terms of what has been a frustrating season for both of these teams. And then there's no doubt that heading into the off season, both of these teams is going to have a lot to do in terms of trying to pick themselves up and trying to compete heading into next season. But that being said, I am now going to switch the board one last time, as I am going to look at the last game that is going to be happening from this weekend's action, which is LAFC versus the San Jose Earthquakes. Now, before I get into the final game of this weekend's action, which is the San Jose Earthquakes versus LAFC, I just want to quickly talk about how this game could either be postponed or it could not happen this season. And the reason why that is the case is because today there was 2 positive cases of COVID-19 that was coming out of the LAFC camp, and that I even saw on their Reddit page that some of their fans say that there's actually 3 players or staff members that got tested positive for COVID-19. And if that, of course, is the case, and if this continues where if there's there's going to be that many players that is going to test it positive for COVID-19, surely the league is not going to let this game happen, is it? I mean, 3 players is right around that range where the league is going to pull the plug in terms of a game that is happening. And there's also no guarantee the fact that those couple of players that got tested positive for COVID-19, did they actually spread to other people, and that if you're an LAFC fan, you are definitely holding your breath that you're hoping you're not dealing with a Colorado situation that the Rapids had to deal with just last month. But either way, if this game is going to be postponed, most likely it's going to be made up during the middle of the week, where that's usually where all the games are made up in case of those games that got postponed earlier this season, or the fact that if we're still not able to play the game on Wednesday, most likely this game is not going to happen. And, if you ask me, does this actually hurt the Quakes if this game does not happen, or does it actually help the Quakes in terms of this game not to happen? Well, in some sense, you could say that it does help with the way that, if this is a loss that we could suffer against LAFC or a draw against LAFC, that's going to hurt our points per game ratio. However, the thing that does hurt for us, and in my opinion, I think this does kind of hurt the Quakes in some sense, because I feel like out of these last 2 games against LAFC and then on the road against Seattle on decision day, if there's one game that I think could be a game where we can get points and even get a win in these 2 games, because these next 2 games are against really tough opponent, and if the Quakes does make the playoffs this season, these 2 games can really show what they're actually made of, and can they actually just go into the playoffs and not be like a one and done situation. This game could really kind of test that, and that this might be the game most likely the Quakes are going to get all 3 points and could clinch themselves in the playoffs. In fact, speaking of playoff position for the Quakes, well, they can of course clinch the playoffs if they do win against LAFC, and that the Whitecaps are able to lose or tie against Portland, and that they can also clinch the playoffs if they tie against LAFC and Vancouver was able to lose to Portland, and RSL was able to, well, RSL and the Galaxy does end in a tie in that resort. Now, for LAFC, they're currently 5th according to the points per game ratio, and there is no doubt that LAFC is really hoping this game will be played, and that if you ask me, if they do not play this game, does it actually hurt their chances in terms of seeding? Absolutely, especially the fact that depending on the Minnesota resort, if Minnesota is able to beat against SKC, then Minnesota will improve their points per game ratio, whereas for LAFC, they just they can't do anything about it, because this game could potentially not be in play. So at the end of the day, I really hope this game does play. I mean, I really want to see the Quakes play one more time at home before they have that really tough road game against Seattle, that I'm just putting my finger crossed that is not the game that is going to determine playoffs for us, because I know the last time when we play against a Cascadia team on the final day of the season in terms of a chance to make the playoffs, we lost that game, and that was the Portland Timbers last year. So hopefully this will be the game that pretty much clinched the playoff position for the Quakes, and if it isn't the case, at least heading into the next game, we would get in a good position where we don't really need to have to win, or even get a draw in terms of getting ourselves into the playoffs, and maybe just really hope other teams can kind of help us out in terms of getting us into the playoffs this season. So yeah, we shall see in these couple of days what is going to be the announcement. If there is going to be an announcement that this game is going to postpone it, I will kind of mention it during the review on Sunday. But if this game is not going to be postponed, then I'm definitely going to keep an eye on this one, because yeah, this is crunch time for the Quakes, and that these last 2 games, I said that in that last game against RSL, yes, it was a big win in that playoff 6-pointer, but the job is clearly not done. And in fact, the job just got harder with the way that we're now going with a points per game system to determine playoffs. But there you have it. That is pretty much it for this week's review for this weekend's MLS action. Let me know in the comments below, what do you think of these these 13 games, and let me know in the comments your prediction for all 13 of these games. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time.